Here we go. This is the test that I have wanted to do for a long, long time. And finally, it's gonna happen. What is it? It's the controversy addressed. The controversy about rod ratio. What is rod ratio? Simply, it is the length of the connecting rod divided by the stroke of the crankshaft. It seems really simple, right? However, if you read about engines at all, you will find out that people think it is like the most critical part of engine performance. You'll find guys who are designing their whole camshaft and cylinder head package around the length of the connecting rod. Now, you might ask yourself, why could it possibly matter? So let's get into that. What I've got here are connecting rods that were supplied to us by K1. This one is 6.135 inches long. This one is 6.8 inches long. So the rod ratio of these two, with the crank in this engine, which is 3.76 inch stroke, for the short rod, the ratio is 1.63 to 1. For the long rod, the ratio is 1.8 to 1. Now, what happens inside the engine is that piston speed is the same throughout a full revolution, regardless of your rod length. For example, if you want to calculate your piston speed in feet per minute, all it is RPM multiplied by the crank stroke, and then you take that and divide it by 6, and you get your average piston speed in feet per minute. But the thing is, with different rod lengths, the piston is accelerating and decelerating in different places in the cylinder. The short rod is faster in mid-cylinder on its way up, and it is faster across top dead center. It spends less time with the piston dwelling at top dead center than the long rod. The long rod tends to slow down the piston speed at mid-cylinder stroke, and it also makes the piston dwell longer at top dead center. Now, inversely, the long rod makes it dwell more at top dead center, but less at bottom dead center. And the opposite is true with the short rod. It dwells less at top dead center and more at bottom dead center. And so people have all sorts of theories about how that piston position and speed in the cylinder can affect the performance of your engine based on the camshaft and the cylinder head and a bunch of other variables. And you know what? I could talk about it forever. But instead, what we're gonna do is put it to a real world test in this engine right here. Basically, we're starting with a big block Chevy platform, but we are using a Dart aftermarket block. And because I wanted to test two radically different lengths of rods, I mean, there's a difference of more than 5/8 of an inch here, I had to do the math to figure out the engine that would take the biggest difference. And this is what I figured out. From 6.135, which is, by the way, a stock rod length on a big block Chevy, all the way to 6.800, which is really big, required a very short stroke crankshaft. So this thing begins with a crank that has a stroke of 3.76 inches. It's like a stock 396 or 427 crank. I used the Dart Big M block in order to get a big bore of 4.5 inches. And the reason I did that is I wanted some displacement. And this thing still turns out pretty small. It is a 478 cubic inch engine. Now, with that in mind, I knew that I wanted a lot of RPM in order to show a difference in rod ratio. And I also knew that I wanted to make some high compression so that it would make some power. So we begin with some very custom pistons that were designed for me by JE Pistons. These are specific just for this test. What's trick about them is that they are able to go into the Dart cylinder head and collect the data points, basically make a digital map of it, and make a dome that was the largest that it could possibly be for this engine. And they also cut the valve reliefs just for this camshaft. So the final compression ratio is 12.25 to 1. The other thing that we need to look at here, and this is another aspect of connecting rod length, is if I put these side by side and line them up exactly at the top of the dome, not at the top of the dome, but the top of the flat surface of the piston, you can see that the compression height of these two pistons is very different, because in order to package between the stroke of the crankshaft and the deck height of the engine, you have got to offset the compression height of the piston to accommodate the length of the rod. So you can see here with the short rod, I've got a very tall piston compression height. With the long rod, that shortens up quite a bit. And frankly, frankly, with the pin up here in the oil rail of the oil ring, that can cause problems. But conversely, with the short rod, you've got to have a much heavier piston than with the long rod. And so the piston itself can affect the performance based on the rod length. And here's another thing that's an effect of long versus short rods, and I'm gonna exaggerate it here on the table. Let's imagine that these pistons and rods are both in an engine with the same amount of crankshaft rotation. With the long rod, the angularity from the piston to the rod might be about like that. With the short rod, it is much more extreme, something like that. And therefore, the short rod causes more side loading on the piston. This rod is actually shoving the piston more this way into the cylinder wall, which can lead to friction problems and mostly more bore wear. So that's how I've specially built the low end here, and I really have to thank everybody at Race Winning Brands for working with me through all of this. Now let's talk about the basic specs. The cylinder heads are a Dart Pro 1 CNC aluminum deal 365 inlet runner. And at the top end, I've got a Dart single plane intake manifold and a Holley 1050 Dominator carburetor. The big deal in all of this is going to be the camshaft. It is a honkin' big solid roller from Crane. The specs on the duration at 50 thousandths tappet lift are 284 on the intake, 296 on the exhaust. It's on a 112 lobe separation angle. That cam is important because it is going to allow this thing to run up to 7,500 RPM. Honestly, it could go more, but we limited it to that because we were concerned about the longevity of the valve train with a stock type rocker arm and with stainless steel valves in it. So this thing is going to make some big honking power, but the question is, what is the different rod length gonna do? And to do that, we actually built two completely different short blocks, assembled by our friend Andy Mitchell, which we really appreciate. So we're gonna switch the top end just from one short block to the other so that we can keep everything as consistent as possible. The first engine that we're gonna put on the pump is the long rod engine, the 6/800-inch rod. Dudes, I'm really excited about this. I've wanted to do it since 1997 when I was the editor of CarCraft.
Oh, wow. Man, that's a long time to wait, Freiberger.
Well, the
patience is a virtue.
Rod ratio thing is like one of the most talked about subjects that people have about engines, and we're finally gonna find out. Because I've never seen any of the aftermarket do this test. I've heard the stories about Ray or Morrison. I mean, you've never done it, right?
I have never done this personally. I've always leaned on that David Rear thing that I remember reading in the back of National Dragster, you know, because they had done all that stuff in the Pro Stock and NASCAR stuff, and kind of, you know, took that as a lead. But as far as testing it here, we've never done it.
I thought you guys did a magazine test years and years ago, and the guy was claiming just enormous benefits for the long rod.
That's the small block that Chevrolet should have built.
Exactly. You know what? A lot of people remember that story in Hot Rod Magazine. Yeah, the 350 Chevy should have built. Pete Saueracker, I think, wrote that.
That's it.
Yeah.
And did you do that test?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But do I remember the test? No.
Well, the thing is, I don't think there was any A/B. He was just categorically claiming that the long rod was the most
The other
awesome
problem
thing.
was he was trying to run 12-to-1 compression.
Yeah.
Thinking that the long rod was somehow going to make it through that. And he was grabbing a lot of that info from some stuff that Smokey Unick had written earlier on.
Well, Smokey Unick always said, put the longest rod in that you can possibly find.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I don't know what to expect. I really don't.
That's why we're doing it.
I know, and that's what we do.
I think it might turn out to be remarkably similar between the two engines.
We don't know yet.
Yeah.
I'm not coming into this with any preconceived notion. I just want to test it. So Steve has got this thing completely tuned up. He's handled the carburetor calibration. He's done a timing sweep on the thing and found out that it's insensitive between 34 and 38 degrees total.
It's the same. Yeah.
So we've got it at 38 degrees, and when we do the other engine, we'll do that same timing sweep. And as a matter of fact, I think we'll look at the fuel curve also. So with the knowledge that this is ready to go, fire it up and let's do it. All right, here we go with the long rod engine. 6.800 is the length on these connecting rods.
Wow, not bad. Big block Chevy.
It's pretty stout. Yeah. stumbled into a pretty good combo for no reason, even though nobody in their right mind would build a 478 cubic inch motor. But aside from that,
478 is the motor of the month.
right?
Hey, those 396
Or you're
cranks.
hoping they are.
But for what it is, it's fairly stout.
No, it actually is really good. With a
Yeah.
couple of changes, it could be really good.
So there's that baseline pull all tuned up. We've got 804.2 at 7,300 RPM and 622.9 pound-feet of torque at 5,700. Not bad for what it is.
That's a nice motor.
You know what? We need to pick up more data. So there's a couple of other things Steve and I were talking about that we would like to do so we can fully explore this. We want to do
Low
first,
RPM.
low RPM. So what we're gonna do now is run this thing up to 3,000 RPM and just park it there and take a bunch of data points. And the reason we're doing that is to try and discover if there is a difference between the long rod and the short rod as far as low end torque. Our third and final test is gonna be steady state at peak torque. And what we're looking for there is what's called a torque offset. We're gonna see the difference between the torque number that it makes during a power sweep versus the torque that it makes at steady state. And we're gonna compare that same thing once we get to the short rod engine and see if there's any difference there. What we did there is the 3,000 RPM, it collected a whole bunch of data points, and we're gonna average them all, and the answer is 399.3 pound-feet of torque. Surprisingly low for what this thing is, but that's because it's way out of its range. So our conclusion there is at 5,700 RPM steady state, our average torque is 633.7 pound-feet. Now, if we look at a curve versus what it made at steady state, we're gonna see a little bit of a difference. See, 633 is more torque than it made anywhere. So on this graph, what you're seeing is that the red line is the sweep at 300 RPM per second, and this data point is static. And it is, you know, it's 11 numbers up from when we swept it. We have our 3 different data points that we were concerned about. I think we're ready to go swap it over to the short rod
Do all
engine.
the fun stuff.
Yeah. And the changeover begins. We're about to swap from the long rod engine to the short rod engine. Now we're gonna use the exact same cylinder heads, intake manifold, distributor, and carburetor, and also the crank trigger on the thing. We're just gonna change the short block, which is as identical as we could possibly make it with the exception of the rod length. You can see that we've got a crank trigger ignition on this thing. That's just so we can be much more precise about the ignition timing. This thing made the same power between 34 and 38 degrees total on timing, and I'm super curious to find out if that's any different with the short rod engine. Prepare to be somebody. We're really close. We took the whole top end off of the other engine, and now we're dealing with our short rod, short block. And we got the cylinder heads on here. He's torquing it up. We got to put on valve train, intake manifold, ignition, and boom.
This torque wrench is digital, so it's high tech. It gives me a beep and a digital display of exactly what the torque is. That is completely failure proof.
We've got our short rod engine on the dyno, and we've been playing with it here just a little bit, messing around with ignition timing. So we know that the optimal timing on the long rod engine was 38 degrees, and essentially it didn't care between 34 and 38 degrees where you actually left it. What we found out with this thing is that it's a little bit more sensitive to timing. It didn't really like 36, it was okay at 38, and between 40 and 42, it really made the same power. So we're looking at a 2-degree difference between long rods and short rods in the timing that it prefers. One of the things I want to get out of you, though, is we're going to do 2 completely different short blocks here. I mean, they're identical parts-wise. They were assembled by the same guy. They're the same. But do you think they're going to run the same? If they were identical, the same connecting rod, everything, well, those 2 engines perform identically on the dyno.
In theory, they're supposed to, but within a percentage. What I can tell you is that I've done a number of sets of twins in big boats, and it is not uncommon for me to see 10, 12 horsepower difference, even in twins that were built identically.
That's the answer I was hoping to get from you. And the reason is if we see 5 to 15 difference, we have to call that about the same because it can be the difference in ring seal, valve job. I mean, we've attempted to sort all that out identical, but there can be a difference. I'm hoping that we also see a difference in the shape of the curve based on what I've read about people's beliefs on long rod versus short rod, not just peak power, but where it's making power. Yeah, so we're gonna run it right now and show you what it makes with the short rods.
Pretty good.
It was pretty good.
Yeah.
So the first thing that I'm gonna do is tell you what our peak numbers are before we look at a graph overlaying the two. So peak, basically the same torque. We saw 621.2 at 5,800, 100 RPM higher than we saw with the long rod. And basically it's the same torque number. It's 622.9 with the long rod versus 621.2 with the short rod. That's a wash. But then you look at the horsepower, and we used to make 804 at 7,300 with the long rod, and the short rod made 815 at 7,400, which is, again, 100 RPM higher than what we saw with the short rod. So that is like the opposite of what you generally hear about long versus short rod.
Yeah, well,
Not according to you?
well, I've heard conflicting theories
Well,
on
that's
that.
the thing about the whole deal, is
Yeah.
I say, generally, I think I hear that the long rod is better for high RPM, but you're right, there are different theories from different people about what's gonna happen. Let's look at the curves and see what overall it did. Wow, okay, so here are our power curves with the red lines representing the long rod and the black lines representing the short rod. And the short rod ends up throwing away some low-end torque and making some high-end power.
Well, you'd expect a long rod to make a little more torque at the very bottom.
You would?
I would.
Because that's the opposite of other theories that I've seen. I've seen
What
both.
everybody else will tell
Yeah.
you, or what you read typically now, is that the shorter rod is going to help the port be more active and help bottom end and
All that.
gobbledygook. But you know, you're the guy with the long rod theory.
By the same token, you know, if you're going to gain that at the bottom, you're going to give up somewhere else because everything's a trade-off, and you'd expect to see that little edge at the top.
Well, let's go ahead and run the other tests that we ran with the other engine. Let's do steady state 3,000 RPM. I think we suspect the answer now, but let's do it for the sake of comparative analysis.
So identical
Same.
almost.
Same. Interesting. So the steady state torque at 3,000 RPM with both these connecting rods is identical. 399.2 versus 399.3. I'm calling that the same.
You think?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we're going to do a steady state torque test at 5,800 RPM, which is where this connecting rod made its peak torque number of 621.2, but that's not the number we're about to see when we run at steady state. So this is going to be steady state 5,800. Okay, the average torque throughout gathering that data was 634.9, and it was 633.7 with the other deal. So basically steady state, we're calling no difference. But now we're gonna look at the difference between steady state and sweeping the engine, which will tell us the difference in inertia of how heavy the parts are. All right, so with the long rod, the difference between steady state and sweeping it was 10.8 pound-feet. So now we have to look at the same thing with short rod, 621.2 versus 634.9. So the difference between sweeping and steady state is greater with the short rod than it is with the long rod, which would add up to the fact that
Slightly.
it's got a heavier weight to it.
Slightly, yeah. It's showing a trend.
I guess our final conclusion is that, boy, the long rod made more power below 5,500 RPM, and the short rod made more power above 6,500, but the difference up at the top end is negligible, and the difference at the bottom end could be in inertia, but my takeaway is that I still wouldn't build my engine around the rod length. Here's another thing that David Rayer and Dick Maskin were saying, is that a huge part of the difference is how the piston construction affects the piston ring stability. And I don't know if in this piston, the difference in compression height is really going to make a difference in that or not. But they're saying if you get the pin up into the oil rail, that you could see some more piston ring instability, which can lead to stuff like this.
When you've got a skirt this long, it's going to have more tendency to rock than a skirt this long.
Right.
So, you know, when it's unloading and loading, and maybe that's what we're seeing is ring stuff in the short piston and the long rod at the top, because that's where you're going to see more issues with rings, is at higher speeds.
So that's really a huge takeaway here, is that what we're seeing in the difference might not necessarily be the connecting rod itself, but the effect of weight and piston ring stability. So it could be other things.
The effect of the package.
Yeah. More questions than answers, as usual, on Engine Masters. Let's go. Okay, Steve, this is a biggie.
Okay, let's hear it.
I have done a lot of thinking about this and a lot of reading and listened to a lot of other experts, and basically I've got my own conclusion, justification for that conclusion, and then a bunch of caveats.
Well, I'm going to tell you whether you're wrong or right.
That's what I want. We need to debate. Okay, so here's my ultimate conclusion. And I'm gonna narrow it a little bit and say, for typical engines within the world of the stuff we can accomplish, meaning not F1 stuff, not even NASCAR stuff, but you know, engines under 8,000 RPM, whether they're race or street, here it comes, rod ratio does not matter.
You know, I'll tend to agree with that.
Okay.
Within the normal range. I mean, if you go super, super long or incredibly short and do something crazy, well, then it might matter some.
Right. One guy I trust a lot, David Rayer from Rayer Morrison Racing Engines. This guy is like top end, very respected engine builder. And his opinion after a huge test that they did on a NASCAR engine with like a really short rod and a really long one, and what he said was hundreds of camshafts, was exactly the same thing, 0. So I did let that influence this a little bit, but what really impressed me is when we did the static test at 3,000 RPM and 5,700 RPM, we found out
at that point, we had identical results.
Identical results. And so that kind of takes everything but the rod length itself out of the picture. There's no inertia problem and there is no ring flutter problem.
Yeah, we're eliminating variables and we're just basically getting down to distilling the facts.
And so the other part of my conclusion was that the slight differences that we saw at the bottom end and the really slight difference we saw at the very top end are attributable to other factors, like inertia at the bottom end and maybe some ring seating issues at the top end with the long rod. In my opinion, what you want to do is pick your stroke first, which is going to be based on displacement and piston speed and things like that. And the next thing you want to do is call like JE Pistons and design the best piston for your ring package. And once you've got that down, you connect the two with a connecting rod and you have a nice day and don't worry about it. So now I have to go into the caveats, which are the rod ratios that we tested in this thing were 1.8 with a long rod and 1.63 with a short rod. That is not in the range of what anybody who loves rod ratio talk considers bad.
No, that's all pretty normal. In fact, most production engines fall within that range.
Right, so we didn't really test screwing it up, but I think we still were able to, you know, look at a range and look at a difference.
Yeah, and the takeaway for me is basically every time people think they're gonna be super geniuses and do something completely out of the norm and prove everybody wrong, they usually prove themselves wrong.
Usually. So other caveats, I would say, once again, we're not dealing with F1 here, we're dealing with average stuff. And, you know, this is just one test. There's gonna be other people who are gonna say, we used the wrong cam, we used the wrong cylinder head, we had the wrong compression ratio, we should have used a different length rod. It goes on and on and on and on. And you know what? That is for you to discuss and argue based on the data that you can see here every single time on Engine Masters.